This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mr. Guy Lookabaugh, interviewed by Mr. Pendleton Woods on August 6, 1971, in Oklahoma City. Mr. Lookabaugh is a wrestling champion, participated in the Olympics of 1924, and World War I veteran.
This is Penn Woods recording for the Oklahoma Living Legends. We're at the home of Mrs. George Calvert, and we are visiting with Mr. Guy Lookabaugh. The date is August the 6th, 1971. Doing the interview with me is Mr. Charles Sausberry, a longtime sports buff and a longtime sports writer for many years with Daily Oklahoman, wasn't it? Not the Times?
Both.
With the Daily Oklahoman and Oklahoma City Times. We'll be visiting with Mr. Lookabaugh, who is a past champion and one of Oklahoma's early wrestling greats, as well as a distinguished coach for many, many years. One of the early Oklahoma A&M wrestlers and the first national champion of the produced by the state of Oklahoma in wrestling. I believe this is correct, isn't it? Are you the first? Were you the first national champion in that?
First Olympic competitor.
First Olympic competitor. To begin with, I'd like for you to give a little bit of your family background, where you were born, who your parents were.
I was born in what is now Blaine County in Oklahoma. At that time, it was Oklahoma Territory. My parents came down from Kansas, bought land rights right after the rush. The land that somebody had settled on, they bought his rights and continued to live there throughout their life.
Could you give me your father's and your mother's name?
Frank Lookabaugh was my father, and my mother was Kate
And her maiden name?
Sims.
Mm-hmm. That's S-I-M-S.
S-I-M-M-S.
Two M's. Where did you go to school?
I started at District 51 Country School in Blaine County, what is now Blaine County, 3 miles from the place where I was born. Took my high school work at Weatherford in the prep school. Some college work at Weatherford, some college work at Stillwater, where I got my bachelor's degree, and then later took a master's doing work at the University of Iowa.
When did you first become interested in sports, and how did this come about?
I don't know the answer to that. I have to be someone older than I am to know when I became interested in it. I grew up on a ranch, and there was a river, and we swam, and we played games, and when I went to school, we played games, and on the ranch, I wrestled with the farm hands and bales of hay and pigs and calves and whatever there was to engage in some kind of competition. When I went to school, high school at Weatherford, I was small. I was under 100 pounds at age 16 when I went there the first year, and I gained 37 pounds that year, and I thought that put me up in a class big enough that I could get out and compete a little bit. So a bunch of wee boys my age got up a football team. We didn't have a coach. We didn't have any rules. We had one football and whatever clothing we had to play in, but nevertheless we scheduled a couple of games and played both of them. One of them was with Sayre High School at Sayre. Incidentally, they were coached by the oldest brother of two of the boys on our team. He was a grain buyer. He bought wheat, operated an elevator out there. And in his spare time, he liked athletics, and he coached this team and brought them over to Weatherford. And we played the second game at Weatherford. We had played them at Sayre, and they beat us. After the game was over, when we were sitting around the Raymond dinner table, eating our dinner and talking about the game, Carl Raymond, who is the coach of our opponents and the brother of the two fellows on the team, was telling us an incident that happened in the game. He said, when you got that drive started down there and we're about to score, I sent in a player. And he said, who do you want to come out, Coach? And I said, I don't want anybody to come out. You get in there and stop that drive. And about a minute away, he said he put another one in there the same way. And he said, they stopped you all right. One of the boys said, well, Coach, that made us 12 men on the field. He said, yes, we needed all 12 of them.
When in your life did it begin to appear to you and those who were working with you that you had a special talent in sports? A particular talent?
Well, I don't know. I played a little football at Weatherford there, to college, and I played basketball there. Did a fairly good job of playing basketball, and I thought a fairly good job playing football. Then in 1917, I left there and went to school at A&M and enrolled in school there that fall. Checked out a suit, and there were about 70 of us on the field, and I thought I probably was the poorest one of the whole lot. They were all freshmen except one. That is one sophomore. That was Cliff Gallagher, Ed Gallagher's brother. Cliff later went on to coach in the East and became quite a coach in his own name. There was an interesting story, that is, was interesting to me. I went up there, and a young fellow who grew up in the same community that I did, had been in school there a year or two, kind of knew his way around, and I found him. His name was Bill Smith. And Bill took me over to the gym and was going to help me get a football uniform. So it was a little bit late. The fellows had already checked out, suited up and gone out. They were out on the practice field, but Ed Gallagher was in his office. So Bill and I went in, and Bill introduced us and told Ed that that I wanted to get a uniform. And Gallagher said, well, our equipment man tells me that all of our equipment's checked out. We don't have any suits left. So I was pretty easy to turn off, and I walked on out. Bill stayed there and talked with him a little bit, and later this was the way he reported that conversation to me. He said, I told him, Ed, you're a fool if you don't get a suit for that boy. And Ed said, you mean that little bow-legged guy, you think he's a good football player? Bill said, I bet you $100 that he'll make your traveling squad. I bet you $100 that he'll make your team. I bet you $100 he'll play all the way through the first game. Well, he made some impression, I guess, because Ed went back and checked with the equipment man, and they found a suit from some big man who had checked it out and wasn't wearing it. And he had it in his locker, and they put it on me. I had no trouble getting into it. The shoes were 2 sizes too big, and everything else was in proportion. So that's the way I got started there. And to follow up, I did make the traveling squad, and I did start the game, and I did play all the way through. We lost that game to Kansas State College at Manhattan. But that was the way I got started in football.
Do you have any thoughts, Charles, on this up to this point?
Well, I was wondering the gap between 1917 and 1924 seems pretty long, and something came in between there. Now, you were up at A&M then quite a number of years, except for the war.
Well, you fellows may not remember it, but I remember we had a war along about that time, and I went one semester to A&M and dropped out and went home. I had been registered and 1A, and it looked like I was one that they wanted, and they'd want me right quick. So on that basis, I went home and went to work on the ranch waiting for my call. They postponed it until in the summer. They're having, I think my uncle must have had some influence there, because he was quite a shorthorn breeder, and he was having a big sale, and I think he might have gotten me postponed for a little bit. At any rate, on the 28th of May, I received my summons to report and become a soldier. Then I went overseas within less than a month. I was in overseas service.
What were you with?
The 36th Division Headquarters Troop. And we went through a period of training, various and sundry places, and finally got into 22 days of action on the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And then we were taken out to be re-equipped and give us a little rest. And finally, on November the 11th, which came 3 days after we'd been ordered back into action, and the order was countermanded, and then 1 day before we were ordered back into action, and that was countermanded, so we didn't go back into action. The day that the armistice was signed, I was in some little French village there helping wash out the mud out of the streets.
Did you remain in the Army of Occupation? for any period of time?
No, we weren't called Army of Occupation. It just took quite a bit of time to get that many men lined up and organized and on their way home.
Did you participate in any athletics during your military career?
I didn't participate in anything until after the armistice was signed.
Then I noticed here I've got quite a nice story that apparently was unpublished at the time of 4 Oklahoma Indian football players who made a command appearance along with 36th Division, or a combined 36th Division and 7th Division football team for King Albert and Blackjack Pershing, right?
Would you tell about that?
Well, I was just a private, and all I knew was what they told me to do or what I heard or what I could read. We did have some Indians in our outfit. We had a fellow by the name of Harold Masseet, who was a Cheyenne. I grew up out among the Cheyennes, so it was easy enough for Harold and me to become quite buddies. And then there was Bob Choate, who was from Bunch, Oklahoma, right over near Tahlequah, where I live now. Bob was a big husky fella, and he had attended Carlisle. Masseet had attended Oklahoma State, and I, of course, had attended one semester at Oklahoma A&M.
But hadn't you played a while at Weatherford at Southwestern Normal?
Yes, I played at Weatherford. Played at Weatherford when next year we had a coach, and we played. It's quite interesting. Back there in 1914, 15, 16, Oklahoma had only been a state 6 or 7 years.
Right.
And when you look back from the vantage point of 1971, back there to that point, they were doing pretty well to get as much organization as they did have.
Now, this story does point out that King Albert, a great sportsman, had written to the American Commander-in-Chief asking to be allowed to see an American game of football. And General Pershing not only complied by ordering this colonel to get up the team, but I believe you said a while ago that he was there himself.
Why don't you backtrack now and tell that story from the beginning about the
Game?
This game, yes.
This particular game that you're referring to.
Yes, although I would like for you not to just pick up where he left off, but to backtrack and tell it.
Well, when the armistice was signed, it was a little while before we moved back into the quarters that we stayed in until we were ready to be shipped back home. On Thanksgiving Day, an armistice was on November the 11th. On Thanksgiving Day, we arrived back at this area where we were going to stay. I remember very well what my Thanksgiving dinner was, because it was a slice of a big round, nice big round onion between 2 real thick slices of cornbread. But after that one meal, we got on our regular schedule and did all right. But Captain Davis called me into the office and said, "Lookabaugh, how would you like to play some football here in the AEF?" And I countered by saying, "Well, Captain, I'd rather go back and play it in the USA." He said, "Well, you won't be delayed any here. And they said, we're going to have something to entertain these people, and I want our division headquarters troop to participate freely in that. And I can assure you that as soon as there's a chance for you to go home, I want to go home as bad as you do, and we'll go together. But right now, I want you to go out and play with this 36th Division football team. We're going to have a football team, and we're going to have a good team. And I want our group to be represented well. Well, as it turned out, there from this troop of full strength 120 men, we had 7 who stayed all the way through on the squad of 35 who constituted the 36th Division football team. And a schedule was made out. We played our first game on Christmas Day, the second game on New Year's Day. And as we went on, we had 13 games lined up. This game with the 7th Division, in which the King and Queen and notables from the USA were in attendance. That was one of the regularly scheduled games, and we played that. The King and Queen were there, and they were glad to see us, and we were glad to give them a good game.
Now, this story says there were 25,000 people there.
And
it was the semifinal game of the AEF championships.
That's right, it was. The next game we played then was the 89th Division. Played the 89th Division, and that was the final championship game. We lost to them 13-7. It was an unhappy day for the 36th Division because we had won 12 games in a row. That was one of those hard setups. When you lose, well, you're through. But that was the way that was arranged. That was the way the game happened to be scheduled and played.
Now, maybe Guy is a little too modest to tell quite the story of that game before. I think that might have been your 12th straight game. But
Oh, there's one little point there. You might be interested in this. Queen said she'd, the boy who made the winning score, she'd give him a big kiss, and it turned out that the game was played on a very wet field, and all the players were very muddy, and you couldn't tell whether they were what color they were. So she said that she would be satisfied if we would line up so that she could snap a picture with her Kodak, which she did under the supervision of General Pershing, who lined the fellows up. Some GI back there who wasn't a football player, but he got up there so he could get in the picture. And while the Queen was trying to get the Kodak regulated so that she would get a satisfactory picture, this fellow was standing out there in the rain, and he shouted out, "Hurry up there, kid, it's getting wet out here."
well, maybe I still think, for the record, we need to tell a little bit about this game if Guy's not going to. It says that the 7th boasted a formidable array of West Point and former college stars, including the giant Corporal McTurk. He was rated the best fullback in the AEF, and they had annexed the 2nd Army title by hard-won victories over the 35th and 28th Division teams. It says, never before in the history had the little town of Bar-sur-Alby witnessed such a turnout. The crowd, estimated at 25,000, filled the stands. Well, here we are. Lined the playing field in ranks 6 deep and sprawled along the hills which surrounded the village. Before the game, the 144th Infantry Band serenaded the King and Queen with American college airs, and as a grand finale, played the Belgian national anthem. Barbaconi? Something like that, Guy. While 25,000 uniformed spectators stood at the salute. And then it says the Arrowhead 11 won the game in the last quarter when Lookabaugh went over for a touchdown and Masheet added the extra point to give the Oklahoma-Texas 11 a 7-0 margin over the 7th Division, wasn't it? Both teams were lined up in front of the royal box after the game where they posed for the snapshot taken by Queen Elizabeth. So, I suppose Guy was the one she was supposed to have kissed.
That was a very interesting game, and all of the games that we had were interesting. There were a lot of good players, some who had a lot of recognition. All Americans were about as common as you would find them on the Notre Dame campus, I guess.
Tell about your going back to we started back to Oklahoma A&M. You played in that first game. What was in your was this your freshman year or sophomore year, or were freshmen allowed to play then?
Freshman year, yes. Freshmen were not only allowed to play, but they couldn't have had teams without freshmen. It was during that war year, all of the upperclassmen raced off and volunteered and got into the service. And of this squad, our entire squad, there was only one sophomore, and that was Cliff Gallagher, who was Ed's brother.
Did you what sort of record did you make that year? Did you? I know you had made some scoring records later, but during your freshman year, did you achieve any particular records in football? We'll talk about football first, and then we'll swing into wrestling.
No, I scored a few points and made a lot of yards, but really not anything spectacular. The one thing about it, in those days, you played both ways. You played offense and you played defense. And I must have done fairly well that year because during the entire football season, I never failed to start a game. I never failed to finish a game. I played all of the time in all of the games up to the last game, and I had an understudy by the name of Pearson, who never had gotten in the game, and thank goodness the coach pulled me out and put Pearson in to give him a chance to get at least get his feet wet in the last 2 minutes of the last game of the season.
Now that was 1917?
That was the fall of 1917, yes.
Now you came back what year?
Well, I went to service in 18 and came back in the fall of 19. I enrolled again in school in the fall of 1919.
What were some of the highlights of your football career at I keep saying OSU, at Oklahoma A&M College?
Well, Oklahoma A&M had never won a football game from Oklahoma University up to the time I entered school there. And they'd been playing since about 1892 or 1893. And quite naturally, they were our biggest opponent, and when we beat them, that was the outstanding point in the school year. By beating them, if we'd lost all the other games, which we didn't, it would have been a very successful season.
Was that 1919?
1919.
1919.
I think that's
we beat them in 1917. Now they beat us in 1919, but we beat them the second time that A&M had ever won, and I was back there again, or still, as you would choose to use. And Adam Esslinger was on the 1917 team.
He was the big tackle, wasn't he?
No, he was a quarterback.
Quarterback.
And he was on the 1924 team. We were the only two that helped out the first two, win those first two games from Oklahoma University.
Now,
That was a big game.
There, the coach yet?
Malbetch was there in 1924.
That was his first year. He came down.
No, I think he'd been there. I think he'd been there before that.
Oh, he was at Phillips before then, wasn't he?
Yeah, I played against in 1917 or 1919. I played against his team, his Phillips team, at Stillwater, and he had Big John Levi, who was from the Indian tribes. He was probably next to Jim Thorpe as being an outstanding Indian athlete. And Jim was quite a ball carrier. John Levi was quite a ball carrier. And I remember one time I was linebacker. He came through there, and we hit pretty hard. As a matter of fact, they could hear us up in the stands. They could hear us well enough that after the game was over, president of the college, Cantwell, came out on the field and walked into the gym with me, and among other things, he asked, "Didn't that hurt when you hit that big?"
Well, now you weighed about what?
I weighed about in the 150 somewhere,
And
150.
you were playing halfback against, and he was playing linebacker.
I was
John Levi, and he weighed about what?
somewhere,
And
150.
you were playing halfback against, and he was playing linebacker.
I
John Levi, and he weighed about what?
John weighed up about 200 pounds. He was
That's what
a big fella.
And later he was one of the Indians that John McGraw got pulled into New York.
Yes,
John.
yes, and did a right creditable job. He grew up in the same neighborhood that I did, and in our country baseball team around there, John and George Levi and I and the other kids around there played baseball together.
Of course, he played many, many more times around Oklahoma with the Haskell Indians too.
Yes, yes.
Very great career.
He was an important cog on their team, and they had one of the best teams in USA at that time.
Although they were barely more than a high school team.
Yeah,
They
they were big fellas.
They didn't have any limits on eligibility necessarily.
No limits on eligibility. Just come with us.
Now, this was about the time too that Phillips had its great teams, wasn't it? When Strauss, Dutch Strauss, and or
Yes,
the better team?
yes, about that time.
Well, now this leads into wrestling pretty well. And were you wrestling all this time?
Before we go into wrestling, we might. You set one record. I understand that still stands.
Oh yes.
Isn't that correct?
Well, that's what, according to Odie Wild's reporting and his record keeping. Yes, in 1924, I carried the ball for gains of 129 yards. And according to Odie's records, as of last year when the Oklahoma State OU game was being played, that still stands as a record of individual personal gain in an A&M or an Oklahoma State OU football game, which to me is quite interesting. Nowadays, it's not unusual for the pro boys to get out and make a lot more yards than that, and some of the college boys do it. And Oklahoma State's had some All-Americans and some near All-Americans, and I'm surprised that that record has stood.
Bob Fenimore didn't break it. Garrison didn't break it.
No.
Backtracking just a little, one story he told us, I don't believe we put on tape, this backs into the war again, the story about bringing in, wanting to see some Indians, and calling you in along with, tell us that story. Give us the setting and tell us the whole story.
Well, that was in that game before the King and Queen of Belgium and General Pershing and some high-ranking Navy personnel. General Pershing came down out of the stands and was walking off the field with Captain and Coach Wilmot Whitney, and he said that he wanted to meet some of the Oklahoma Indians on the football team. So Whitney called to me to come over and meet the general. And we were duly introduced and walked off the field together. And the general asked quite a number of questions about I don't remember what now, but my part of the conversation was almost entirely yes and no.
Was it yes, sir, and no, sir?
Yes, excuse me, yes, sir, and no, sir.
You didn't say how then when you met him?
No, I didn't say how. He seemed to be a person that I could have learned to like, though. His personality seemed to be real good. And I felt warmer toward him always after that.
Swinging into wrestling, do you, Charlie, do you have any other thoughts on football?
No, none.
Swinging into wrestling, when did you first become interested in wrestling? And how?
Well, there's a little very interesting incident in connection with that. If you've got a little tape there and don't mind, I'll spin one here for you. After the football season was over, the 1917 football season was over at Oklahoma State, we had a man by the name of Pritchard who was the coach. He was going to coach basketball also. And when the football suits were checked in, basketball suits were checked out, I checked out a suit to go out and play basketball. I'd played basketball at Southwestern, and we'd played the best teams in the state and had as good a record as any team in the state, better than most of them. But no team in the state had a better win-loss record than we had. So I thought I was a fairly good basketball player, and since we had beaten A&M, I kind of wanted to play on the team. So I went out, but before I checked out my suit, the night before that, we were at some kind of a gathering, and the coach came up and was talking with me. I had on a sweater that had a pocket in it, and he was right up close telling something confidential, and stuck his hand in my pocket and pulled out a package of cigarettes. Well, his face got red. He didn't smoke cigarettes, and he didn't approve of anybody who did. His face got red, and I said, "Go ahead and help yourself. I don't mind if you do," which wasn't very diplomatic, but he put the cigarettes back in my pocket, and that was the last conversation we had for quite a while. He didn't choose to use me in his practice in basketball, and I kept coming back out and staying until it became evident that I wasn't going to be used in practice. So finally I said, well, I'll go down and check in my suit. I went down and checked in the basketball suit and had them check me out a wrestling suit. And I went back up on the corner of the basketball court there and found me some fellows and started working on wrestling.
You know, if TV commercials hadn't been barred on cigarettes, he could make $1 million doing a TV commercial, couldn't he?
Sure could.
Well, one of my friends in
champion, right?
in commenting on that, he said, well, you know, that coach spoiled a fairly good basketball player, but he made an excellent wrestler.
Well, now, how many were coming out for wrestling at that time? This would have been...
Oh, 4 or 5 probably.
Just 4 or 5, not enough to make a full...
No. And that first year that we had a team, now 1917, we didn't have a team, but they had some practice and intramural. And so I participated in practice and wrestled in the intramurals and won my weight class in school. But that year they didn't have any varsity competition. They just dropped that during the war years.
And I believe A&M was in the Southwest Conference that time, and when the war was over, they might have gotten back into competition, or did they?
Yes, 1919 they got back in, and of course the wrestling activities came on the spring, so that would be in 1920. We had quite a year there in 1920. A funny thing about the number of men that we had out on the squad in 1919, Dutch Voiles was captain of the basketball team. Dutch was only a fairly good basketball player, and they had only a fairly good basketball team.
Now, Dutch was later the Navy wrestling coach, wasn't
he? Yes, he was. And Dutch was playing basketball, and we didn't have enough fellows to make us a wrestling team. Dutch was a 175-pounder, and he came down there on the mat with me, and we wrestled a little bit one evening. And after it was over with, I said, Dutch, you've got quite a little bit on the ball on wrestling. You come out here and work with us on the mat, and I'll guarantee you that you can be the Southwest Conference wrestling champion, 175-pound class. Well, of course, he knew that I had no way of guaranteeing it. My statement was just the effect that I thought that would be true. But he decided they weren't going to have much of a basketball team. He knew something about basketball. He was going to coach. He had played football, and he thought it would be to his advantage if he had some experience in wrestling, so he decided he'd just give up his basketball captaincy and come out and start in on a sport that he didn't think he was very good at. And he did. And we worked there. I worked with him every day. And he came along pretty well. Finally, there was something happened that I had to go home for 3 or 4 days and I missed those practices. When I came back, I saw Dutch, and he said, I learned something while you were gone, and he said, I can use it and beat you. Well, I said, that's fine, Dutch. I hope you have, but I'm afraid you haven't. Well, he said, I'll show you tonight. So we went out to practice, and I made the mistake of turning loose what I had on him, and he not only didn't beat me, but I pinned him right quick and discouraged him. And I didn't see him anymore for a week. And finally, I met him on the campus, asked him where he'd been, and he said, well, you just showed me that I'm not a wrestler, and I never will be one. So I just decided I'd quit and go to hitting my books a little harder. So I talked him into the notion of coming back. I said, the deal still stands. You would like to beat me. A lot of other people would like to beat me who haven't done it and who probably never will. But that you come on back out, and I'll make a good wrestler out of you. Well, he did come, and the records show that he was a 175-pound Southwest Conference champion in wrestling that year, which...
But wasn't he later national champion too?
No, Dutch never did get a national championship.
But he spent many years coaching at Southwest.
Yes, he was coached at Southwestern, and they had good teams.
And then went on to the Navy.
He coached at Illinois, an assistant coach there for a while. Dutch has been coaching. He did a lot of coaching. He got into pro ball and was a pro coach in Canada and a pro coach in New York, and he coached in some of the bigger colleges in the country.
How long after you started wrestling did it appear that you had a special talent in it, or did this appear immediately?
I don't know. Depends on who you mean, who discovered it.
Well, well, let's say for yourself. Did you feel somewhere down the line you began to feel that you had real potential? Did you feel it from the beginning, or did it come later?
Well, I always wanted to be pretty good at whatever I did, and my brother and I who's older than I am, when we were kids growing up, we had 1,000 wrestling matches, and he won every one of them. But that didn't keep me from working just as hard as I could, and we also had 1,000 fights, and he won all of them until I got to be age 16 and big enough to stand up and give and take, and we didn't have to have any more fights.
How'd your first competitive match come out?
My first competitive match, without thinking what it was, I don't have to stop and think I won it. I have to stop and think to find any that I competed in that I didn't win.
Well, if that was 1920, he'd have had to. You beat Oklahoma University twice that time, 40-0 and 50-0. And Nebraska, 23-19.
That was that 23-19. That was the time that I wrestled in the 158-pound class, and then in the 175-pound class.
When they had to rewrite the rules.
Had to rewrite the rules so that couldn't happen again.
In Oklahoma competition, who do you feel was the best man that you defeated?
That I defeated I don't know.
You don't know. Let's reverse it. I guess you didn't. You mentioned you did lose some matches. Whoever defeated you in Oklahoma competition?
Not anybody.
Nobody did. Even from the beginning.
You were almost undefeated anyway, weren't you?
Yeah, I lost one match. I lost 2 matches in AAU competition.
And
I lost one to Lionel in Birmingham, Alabama at the National AAU tournament in 1920. That's what you've got there.
now, where was he from?
He was from. He had represented Finland in the 1916 Olympics, and I don't know, he was a steel worker someplace. But he, in Olympic competition, he couldn't represent the United States. He won the National AAU Championship that year in that weight class and would normally have gone on to the Olympic team. But he couldn't take the place because he had represented Finland. Well, he beat me, and I would have been the second man in line. So if we had really been on the ball and known what the rules were and been up on our information, I could have been on the 1920 Olympic team.
That would have been 4 years before you finally did get on the Olympic team.
Yes, yes, and I told my teammates and Ed Gallagher after the match was over, I said, I lost to him. But if I ever meet him again, I can beat him, I know. And in 1924, I had the privilege of doing it.
Well, now, in those days, more depended on pinning the man or than riding him as they do today, or how, wasn't there a difference in judging?
As the rules change, the game, the competition changes. I think that a lot of them would be better off if they'd try more for pins now instead of so much riding. And I even went so far as to tell one of the leading coaches in the state that that's the way I felt about it. I thought that he would have been better off, his team would have been better off in that way. But that was my experience. That's what I did. I went after him. I was down at Seminole, went to church down there with my son. We came out, and as a man came up and spoke to me, said, "You're Guy Lookabaugh." I said, "Yes." He said, "You wrestled in the district Olympic tryouts in Kansas City in 1924. "Yes." Well, he said, "I'm the man you beat. I had just had one man to compete against, and he said, I'm the man that you beat."
Yet there was, now this was the beginning of this long string of undefeated teams of Ed Gallagher.
That was the beginning of success begets success.
Let's talk about Ed Gallagher a little bit, from where you first met him, and a little bit about the personality, about him as a coach, and then about some of the teams that were developed during this early period.
Well, I first met Ed Gallagher, as I told you a bit ago, in September 1917 when I went in to check out a football suit. And later on, he was the wrestling coach, had charge of the murals, and I wrestled in those intramurals that year for him. We made all of our trips in those days when we got to where we were making trips, and we traveled around over the country quite a little bit. We made them all by train. And you had a lot of time to talk and figure and plan and think on train trips. And Ed used to always try to draw his boys out and get them to, get them to talk. And then once in a while, why, he'd get himself limbered up and get talking. I remember he grew up in Kansas. He was a sprinter. And one of the stories he told about, he'd go out in the harvest field in the summertime, and they'd talk foot racing. And he'd get a little side bet along occasionally on this business of foot racing. He said he worked with a thrashing machine there. The woman who ran the cook shack didn't like him at all. She called him that old foot racer. But he said that 2 or 3 of them would get together and they'd go someplace and they'd get talking about foot racing. They had a Bynum pitcher here who could outrun anybody on somebody else's crew or in the town or wherever it happened to be. And they'd always get a caller, and they'd place a few little side bets, and then they'd get out and find a little stretch of street that they could use and run 100 yards on it. And Ed would be wearing clean work clothes, and he didn't do much of the talking. The other fellows did the talking, and he'd be wearing clean work clothes. And when they'd get the thing all fixed, why, he'd pull off his bib overalls and shed his jacket and take his spikes out of his hip pockets and put them on. And there he would be in his shorts and undershirt, which was a nice tracksuit. And this cook shack woman didn't like this foot racer pulling off all of his clothes but his underclothes and getting out there and parading up and down the street. Well, that was one of the stories that...
Do you suppose there's any truth in the story that I've heard somewhere that if he couldn't get a match, he would say, well, I will even take you on lying flat on my back to start with. And then he perfected a way to come out of the back starting stance and still get a good jump.
Well, I think Ed could probably run most of us and run backwards.
What town was it that he was a sprinter? He was not a wrestler. At least he never was an outstanding success as a wrestler.
No.
But didn't he come in from some small town as a sprinter?
He was from someplace up in Kansas. I don't remember what, right now I don't remember what his town was. But he came... Yes, he came out of a small high school and entered A&M there, and track was his biggest interest.
And now then, 1920 must have been the year that this long streak of dual meet victories
Yes,
started, about
yes,
73, I believe.
Yes, that's when it started.
And by that time, he'd attracted... by the time he'd gotten beaten, it was one of his own...
Well, in 1920, we went to the National AAU at Birmingham. And as I said, I could have, and maybe some of the other boys could have been on the Olympic team if we had known what the rules were and been on our toes. Well, that was pretty big publicity that the boys out here in the short grass country get in that kind of competition. You see, people from our schools hadn't done that. And also, we beat the University of Nebraska. They were rated as one of the best wrestling, college wrestling teams in the United States.
23-19, and I believe you said you got enough points.
I scored
with those two.
I scored 12.
Wrestling at those two weights to win.
And we took 4 men. The Big Ten was having an invitation tournament. And we took 4 men and went up there. Well, I came off with a gold medal. So that gave us a lot of publicity. And people began to hear about boys from A&M College in Oklahoma, and anybody who wanted to be a wrestler or thought he was a wrestler would come down there and fall in line, just like Strack came down there. Charlie Strack came down. He came down to defend his AAU title, heavyweight, and he liked it down there. I visited with him, and he said, "Well, I'll stay." So he just withdrew from Hamilton and enrolled in Oklahoma State. Then the next year, he went up to Canada to defend his Dominion title that he had won up there the year before, and he got this big fellow McCready to come down with him.
Earl McCready.
Yeah. So success begets success. I was a good wrestler. I made the Olympic team. Charlie Strack liked me and liked the school and went to school there. He went to Canada and wrestled Earl McCready and talked up Oklahoma State to him. And there was a boy or two from out in Oregon and out in that area that came to Oklahoma State. And in the last few years, they've had a lot of them from Japan, China, and in that area, some of the finest wrestlers that they've had.
Now you were, if I remember correctly, the first Olympic wrestler from Oklahoma, and you were in probably the first Oklahoman. How is this?
The first representing Oklahoma. Why don't you tell that?
Well, I was the first person to represent an Oklahoma institution to participate on the Olympic team. Now, Arm Studeville, who was in school at Central College at Edmond that year, came up and he went with us. He had gone to school at A&M before. He'd gone to prep school there, and then he came back. He came back to Stillwater, and he and I were on the same team. That's when they got pretty salty because they had Studeville and me there to teach all the other fellows. I had a little black book, and I wrote down everything that anybody did that was of any consequence, and went back there, and Studi and I worked it out, and we were delighted to pass that on to any of the other boys who were interested in it. And again, your success begets success.
I understand that Gallagher was a student of physics, and that he utilized the principles of physics, particularly those that dealt with pressure, with
leverages
in his
leverages and balance and timing.
Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, his leverages are very important. Take, for example, the half Nelson, what we call the bar arm and half Nelson, a hold that has one more falls than any other hold that has ever been devised in wrestling. And you can take that hold, and the way you apply it, you can have your hand, both hands in the same place, but the way you apply your leverage will make a whale of a lot of difference. You take a fellow that you can't turn over at all in the ordinary manner. If you apply that leverage properly, you can just turn him right over on his back. Gallagher worked on that. He was very much interested in that. And in timing, he didn't show his fellows an awful lot of stuff. He showed them some, but he was interested in them. He encouraged them, and I talked with Ed a number of times. He said, you can teach our boys more than I can, because you can get out there on the mat with them, and you can show them exactly what to do and how to do it. As a coach, I can't do it. I'm on the sidelines. That's my job. And I think that's the way it turned out. Ed had some good men, and his good men helped to get other good men. And Ed did a whole lot to hold them together. He was concerned with all of his fellows. I was thinking a while ago, trying to see if I could ever remember a time that Ed raised his voice unnecessarily.
Very mild and gentle.
Very mild-mannered individual. You'd never pick a mild-mannered man like that to be a great coach in a rough-and-tumble competitive sport like wrestling is.
I was interested a while ago when you mentioned how this friend of yours who challenged him to the $100 bet that you'd make the football team. I remembered that one night Ed Gallagher was at the Golden Gloves. Bet that you'd make the football team. I remembered that one night Ed Gallagher was at the Golden Gloves and I was sitting beside him, and he liked to bet a penny that the guy would or would not last out the round or something like this. We have quite a bit of wit and humor. Do you remember anything like that about him?
Oh, yes, Ed was, he was one of the boys when we were on a trip, and all of the fellows liked him. I don't recall in all of the years that I knew him ever finding anybody who disliked him. He had a very fine personality and was an excellent coach. You can't beat success, you know. If a man succeeds, you may not like it, but you've got to give him credit for it.
Did he have this, somewhere I heard him called the rock meal, the wrestling man, that he had this little capacity to sort of challenge the fellow or to motivate him, to make him want to?
Yes, he must have. He must have had something there. I've never been able to figure it out just what it was about Ed that people liked so well, except that he was interested in people. He was kind. He was considerate. He was courteous. He never raised his voice. He encouraged. And of course, since after his 13 years of success, he has been followed by two other coaches with 13 years of success at the same sport at the same school.
And they were his students. And he would probably not find a school, very many schools that coached wrestling that were not coached by Gallagher or Coach Mann. Is that right?
Well,
up to them.
Yeah. Yes, they were of his school. However, I didn't agree with a lot of them. I had my own methods and techniques, a lot of things that I had learned in the Olympics and in working with other people.
At the Olympics now, how did you do there in 1924 when you and Studeville were there?
I had a decision given against me in the finals of 158-pound class.
And
If you don't mind, I'd like for you to discuss that Olympic thing, because it's a rather unusual thing, and in order to do it, because having stopped the fight in the middle of a fight, I don't want to do the same thing with a tape, because so I'm going to turn this one over. Let's start in to discuss the Olympics, and why don't you discuss the fights you had, with the ones you won, and then I think the details of the one that was decisioned against you, I think these should be a matter of our record here.
Well, let's start out at the beginning. Stuyvesant and I were selected on the Olympic team after the tryouts in New York City, and we had 2 weeks' time before the Olympic boat sailed. Too little time to go home and come back, so they gave us an allowance to live on and stay in New York City that 2 weeks, so that we would be ready to go on June 16th when the boat sailed.
for where?
From New York
To
to Paris.
Paris.
The competition was at Paris. I think we landed at Brest. Seems to me that that's where we landed that year. Well, we had 2 weeks to take in New York City. We did some training and trying to keep ourselves in condition. We had to deal with a new pair of tights in which the dye wasn't perfectly set. The dye kept leaking out on us, and we got a lot of infections. I had Dr. Stuyvesant's infections, and he'd doctor mine. Sometimes we'd have 15 or 20 little infections down over our legs, but they were annoying. Well, finally then we got on the boat and got started, and got pretty well rid of our infections and were able to work out on the boat. And then after we landed outside Paris in our quarters there, we had some time, a week or 10 days, something like that, before the wrestling started. And all of the team was assembled there. We stayed in a chateau and had our quarters there. Nobody there except the wrestling team, which made it a very fine situation for us. But Stuyvesant began to get some more carbuncles. His, this time, were up around his shoulders, up on his neck, sort of. Very dangerous place there. And I had one down just under my belt, on that long muscle along the side of my spine. I had a carbuncle there that rose up half the size of a hen egg. And it looked like the thing was never going to boil itself out. The doctors kept looking at it, and they said, well, you can't do anything, but you can eat and rest, but you can't do any work. And all the time I was getting heavier and heavier, and I had to weigh in at, if I wrestled, at 158 pounds. And I'd been taking a nice boat trip and following a lot of hard work, and then getting out there and just taking it easy, and you couldn't keep the weight from picking up extra weight. The doctor said, you can't compete unless we can get rid of it. If it will get far enough along so I can lance it and get that pus poison out of there, then you can go ahead and work as hard as you want to. Well, I went down there every time they were there to get them to look at it, and finally they said, you just come back in the morning. So I went back in the morning, and he looked at it and examined it, said, yes, I believe I can cut it. And he got out his scalpel and whacked out a hole there, and took out a lot of pus. And he said, all right, now you can go to work. Said it won't get through, won't get in your bloodstream, won't get out in your system. Said it's over there on a piece of cotton. So you can go ahead and go to work, which I did. I went first to the weighing in scales, and I was 12.5 pounds overweight. And it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and the next morning at 9 o'clock we had to weigh in. I had to weigh in. If I was going to weigh in and compete, I had to weigh in at under 158. So wouldn't a lot of these women would like to know now what secret am I going to get to hear about taking off that at 13 pounds of weight in one day? Well, I took it off. It didn't stay off, but I took it off and I weighed in. To give you an idea, I took a bottle of citrate of magnesia. The sun was shining. It was warm, along in the summertime, and out in that near that French chateau. We had wrestling mats out there of assorted sizes, and plenty of places to run. I put on all the sweat clothes I could get on, and found me a place to run, and I ran until I got a good sweat started, and then I went over and piled up on some of those mats and pulled others, had them stack them up over me so that I'd hold that heat in and sweat out as much as I could. I kept that up all day, and on up into the night. And finally, the next morning, when it came time to weigh in, well, I weighed in. They didn't have me wrestle until several hours afterwards, and I'd had ample time to get my system pretty well lubricated with the water again, which I hadn't been able to drink for a couple of days. So at 9 o'clock then that morning, they started the matches. Well, Studeville didn't get to wrestle. A fellow by the name of Wright, who was a Navy, an Annapolis man, competed in his place. Studeville had carbuncles up there on his shoulder and on his neck, and the doctor said no. So while he went over with me and would have represented an institution, he didn't compete.
And this was the first Oklahoma institution that had been represented.
As such.
Jim Thorpe was there first.
Yeah, Jim Thorpe went first, and I remember Tom Poore went. He was from northern Oklahoma, and he went up representing University of Kansas.
He was the high jumper.
He was a high jumper. But I believe I'm right that I was the first one to compete. Okay, now you want the story of the competition.
Right.
All right. First, I met a fellow.
Meanwhile, I want to ask a question. Does this seriously weaken you? Are you weak, or do you get used to this kind of a regime and try and get ready?
That weight losing. Since I had 8 or 10 hours, I assimilated all the food and everything that I needed, and I think when I came up for my competition, I was in as good a shape as I was ever in my life. So the answer is no, it didn't hurt. And I could have done that. Of course, ordinarily I wouldn't have had to take off that much weight because I gained some fat and I had a lot of water in my system that I could eliminate. All right, to come back to the starting. After, as I said, we had quite a little bit of time. We had several days. The Olympics formally opened, and we went and wore our uniforms and saluted the flag and tried to represent our nation as well as we could. And there were 50, I think, other nations represented in 8th Olympiad, which was in 1924. I don't know how many nations there were. We had 50 teams. That's where I get my 50. We had 50 athletic teams on the USS America going over there for that competition. Of course, the winter competition, Winter Olympics, were already over. They'd been held in the winter before. My first competitor was a fellow from Kansas, Canada, who had won the Dominion Championship in our 158-pound class and also in the 175-pound class. He was a pretty good boy, but I didn't have much trouble. There wasn't any question about it. I beat him. Then the second, I wrestled a fellow from Switzerland, their best man, and he was salty. S-U-M-R or something was his name. He was a good man. I had to extend myself to beat him. The next man then was a fellow from England who had won championship of the British Isles 7 times in a row in his weight class. And I didn't have any trouble with him. I wondered how he could have been as poor as he was and still won it. But that's the record that he had won it 7 times. And he dropped his match to me in the Olympics. Then the next one was the number 2. No, the next one was Wino, the fellow that I had wrestled at Birmingham, Alabama in the National AAU in 1920.
4 years before.
Yeah, he came back there and was representing Finland, and I was delighted that I drew him, and I took a great deal of personal pleasure in putting holds on him and then just turning him loose so I could put another one back on him. And I think, I don't have any doubt in my mind, but that he knew what it was all about, and he knew that he was just being played with, and he was kind of glad for it to all be over. Then my next and final competitor was Switzerland's number 2 man. And at the end of the wrestling took 3 periods, 2 best out of 3 periods. If you won the first 2, then the match was over.
How long was this period?
6 minutes, I believe, or 7 minutes. Yeah, 7 minutes, 3 7-minute periods. And we had wrestled 2, and the record showed us 1 each. Then a fellow from Belgium, the 175-pound class, came up there and raised a big fuss, and he wanted him to put his match on next. He had to catch a train to go back home, and thought fussed around there about it, and they finally decided they'd put him on. They did. They stopped our match there with it 2/3 over with, and then they worked on through all the rest of the weight classes, 175, his weight, 191 in the heavyweight classes, and then they dropped back to ours and made that the last match, third of a match, in the Olympic wrestling.
Wound up the whole show with it.
Wound up the whole show with it. Well, in the meantime, the United States had won four first places, had a cinch on a second place, and couldn't do better than third on 2 or 3 other matches, weights, which meant certainly that we had the championship, team championship, tucked away. They used 3 judges, or 2 judges and a referee. One of the judges was a judge and a referee. Judge's decision, 2 had to have at least, well, whoever got 2, the vote of 2, would be the winner. And he was from Switzerland, and he had beaten a man who was serving as a judge from one of the other countries. I don't remember now just which country. But he was a judge, and if the Swiss boy won, fine. If I won, he'd have a chance at second place. The other judge had a man that I had beaten, one of these 5 that I enumerated for you just now. One of them, I had defeated one of them. And when the match was over, well, before I take the match over, let me point out that the rules, that 2 or 3 rules. One, if you ran off the mat and the referee, who should get you back on the mat and who did warn you, 2 warnings represented disqualification. So this fellow, he and I were another rule. If you were partially off of the mat, and incidentally, we just had a 16-foot mat. Now they use 40 or 50-foot mats, but we just had a 16-foot mat, and it's pretty hard to take a fellow down and pin him where he can't work around where he can get a foot or hand or something off the edge of the mat. And that's what this fellow did. We started in there, and he took a hold that was his Sunday hold. I'd already found that out, and in the meantime had decided how to defeat it. He took it, and I gave it to him, and instead of resisting, why, I assisted him and flipped him over, and he hit right square on his back, and I had a pinhold on him, and I was holding him there, but he stuck his foot out and got it off the mat, and the referee stopped the match and not only stood him up and gave him an even break with me, which he wasn't entitled to. That is, I didn't think he was. But he stood him up. He stopped the match, kept me from pinning him, and he came back. Well, he tried the same hold again. He thought he'd make it work. That apparently was a pretty good hold for him. And I did the same thing. I had to roll a little bit with him, and that took us over a little bit toward the edge of the mat. And that time he had one leg off clear up to his knee. That wasn't going to interfere, really, with his ability to go ahead and wrestle, but that was a rule. and they observed that rule. It was just as much a rule that if the referee had to warn you, 2 warnings would make you forfeit the match. That was just as much a rule. And that referee and I spent the rest of the period chasing him across this 16-foot mat. I'd start after him and he'd run off. And then I'd go around him and he'd start back across there. He just backed off, pushing off with his hands. And the referee was fussing at him, but he never did penalize him. And when we got through, they gave him the decision. And in discussing a thing, some of them have said a lot of times, well, on what do you suppose they based that? I said, well, I tell you, I finally figured out what it was. He was better at running away than I was at catching him, so they just gave him the match. So that, as I recall it and can reconstruct it, is the way
Did
that
you wrestle
happened.
anymore after you left?
Oh yes, I had a year of college wrestling after.
Another year of college, right?
I'm 25. I graduated in 25. I started in 17, graduated in 25, but I fought a war and went through a depression and did a couple of years of coaching and a few things like that. So I wasn't just delinquent during that time, but.
Now, were you playing football at this time too? In
Yes,
24?
yes, I played in 24. That's when I stacked up this bunch of 129 yards.
Yeah.
29.
Were you undefeated in wrestling in 24 too, I guess?
Yeah.
Now, in that stretch of years, did you have 4 years of eligibility altogether, or
4 years altogether. Yes.
including the one at Southwestern, or did they count?
Well, that was just high school,
Prep.
Oh, I see.
prep school. Although they had a junior
that
college
time.
there, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
What did you do after you? Did you think of anything else within the college career? Oh, one thing I think we ought to ask. Tell me, those athletes, the great athletes that you knew from Oklahoma, the Oklahoma athletes. I'd like to, those that you knew, I'd like for you to say something about them, discuss them just a little bit, that you were associated with.
Well, I don't know exactly where to begin. I can say this: if you work with men on a team, you build up a very close friendship there, and I still, some of the best friends that I have are among those fellows that I competed with on the various teams.
Do you recall who was wrestling at OU then?
No, I don't recall who they did have.
It hadn't caught on then as the major sport it later became.
Well, Oklahoma State stands first in championships, national championships won, and Oklahoma University, I think, runs second in national championships.
They must have begun to catch fire along about 22 or 23. They were beginning to make a few points on you then.
Yeah. Yeah, it took them a long time to build up enough, though, to where they could win.
Who do you consider your greatest teammate in football?
Greatest teammate in football? Well, there's some very interesting characters. A lot of them that were good. And if I were to tell you who I consider, that would just be one man's opinion. And
You might name one, or you might not confine it to one. Maybe name 2 or 3.
There are a lot of them that are good.
The great.
Let me give you some names of a few of the first wrestlers that they had over there.
Good.
There's Bill Smith. I told you about Bill. Ward Chase. Ward lives down in eastern Oklahoma now. Dutch Voiles. Dutch had quite a coaching career, college and pro, and he's living down in Florida now. He serves as scout for some of the pro teams and came by and stopped in my front yard a year ago, but I was away and he had to leave. I didn't get to see him. Dutch Voiles, you know, he's the one that I told you about that I got him to give up his basketball champion captaincy and go out for wrestling. Archie Reed, there's an awfully good story about Archie that I'd like to tell you, but I'm not going to now. Take too much time.
It was a
But
good
it was,
story. Go ahead and tell it.
well, let me tell you about that.
Okay.
At that time, I had we had three men on the team. Dutch Voiles, 175-pounder. Archie Reed was 191-pounder or heavyweight. Frank Briscoe, 145-pounder. With a lot of other fellows, but these three fellows played a particular part in this little interesting ditty. I told you about being gone, and then Dutch came back, and he became quite discouraged because I beat him as easy as I did. And I got him to come back out, and he did win his Southwest Conference championship. Well, I realized that I had made a mistake. I took Dutch too seriously when he said, "I've got something that I can beat you with." So I just took him too seriously, and I beat him and discouraged him. And I said right then that I was never going to beat one of our fellows. I let him worm away some way. I just wasn't going to beat him. I wasn't going to do anything that would discourage him. I was going to do everything that I could to encourage them. So I had Dutch and Archie and Frank, Snake they call him. Snake lives up in Stillwater. He's a road contractor.
Snake Briscoe.
Jack, I believe Jack was on their first fully organized Oklahoma A&M wrestling team. I believe Jack was on the spring of 1917 team, which was the only schedule that they had before World War I. Well, anyway, to come back to my story, I decided that it was a mistake for me to show my superiority, which is really what I was doing. I was just bragging on myself, showing him how bad I could beat him, how easy. So I'm never going to do it again. So I worked with those boys the rest of the season, and what I came out with, I talked with some of them individually about that and kind of went around easy to find out about it without letting them know in on my secret. And Dutch said, well, he said, Archie and Snake both think they can beat you, but they don't know whether they can beat me or not. And I know that I can't beat you because, he said, because you showed me. But Archie thinks he can. So Dutch didn't think he could, but he worked with these other boys, and the three of them didn't think they could beat any one of themselves. They weren't sure, but they were all three pretty sure they could beat me. Well, none of them ever had, and none of them ever did, and none of them ever will. I brought a wrestling team up to a high school team up to Stillwater for the state tournament. And Archie got to tell me about bragging about some of the holes that he had and said, let's go over to the gym and I'll show you those. I said, well, I'd like to see him. He said he had a hold that he could hold me down with for 5 minutes, and I didn't believe it. So we went over there and got kind of nosed around as we were going across the campus. Said, Arky, look, you're going to have a match over there. Let's go over and see it. And boy, we had 75 or 100 people that gathered over there right quick. We could have filled the gym. We just taken a little more time. But we went over there, and he got all set on his hold that he's going to hold me down with, and it took me a couple of minutes to get loose. And they said, I let you get away that time. Said I kind of slipped. And so I bragged a little bit. I said, well, you'll slip more next time. I said, I'm going to fool with this along. And I didn't. It was taking a little more time, but we went over there, and he got all set on his hold that he's going to hold me down with, and it took me a couple of minutes to get loose. And they said, I let you get away that time. Said I kind of slipped. And so I bragged a little bit. I said, well, you'll slip more next time. I said, I'm going to fool with this along. And I didn't. And he still wasn't satisfied, so he tried it a third time. And by the third time, I had mastered his hold. In wrestling, I always had this sort of feeling. A man might beat me once. Not many of them could. But he'd never do it the second time. A man might make a hold that I wasn't familiar with work on me once, but he'd never make it work again. By the time he tried it the second time, I'd turn it around on him, and that's what I did on this.
What year was this last match? About?
And that,
when you were coaches and he challenged you.
That was in 1922. I was coaching down in Frederick, Oklahoma, a high school down there. And so we started back across the parade ground there after the match was over with. I was talking along with 3 or 4 fellas. He had a bunch of them. He hollered at me, hey, looky, I want to tell you something. Old Arky was always somewhat of a gambler. He tried to have the boys help pay his way through school. He said, you know, when we walked across here going over to the gym, I would have bet you $50 that I could hold you down for 5 minutes. And I would have bet another $50 that I could have beat you in a wrestling match. Well, I said, you were kind of an optimist, weren't you? He said, I certainly would. Said, I wouldn't bet 15 cents now that you couldn't pin me.
Now, how big was Arky?
He was 191. He was a heavyweight, wrestled heavyweight.
After you got out of school, what did you do first?
I took a job coaching wrestling and backfield coach at physical education at the University of Kansas. I stayed there a few years.
You came back into Oklahoma later coaching some high school teams, didn't you?
When I left Kansas in 1920, I stayed there 3 years, and I learned something there. The coaches resigned, and I just let them pull me into it. I wasn't on the football coaching staff. You know how they turn these football coaching staffs over. While I coached in the backfield, I wasn't tied up with that coaching regime, and there was no need for my going, but there's some things I wasn't too happy with there, so I said, well, I'll just resign, get me a better job. And I looked around, and they weren't too easy to pick up. So I finally did get a better job as far as pay is concerned. I went down to Ardmore, Oklahoma, and coached down there for a year, and I had such good success that I had an opportunity to move on. Here comes Ed Gallagher again. My wife and I had gone out 20 miles north of Las Vegas, and I was trout fishing. We had us a cabin out there. And Northeastern State College was looking for a coach. They said, well, we'll try Ed Gallagher and see if he can recommend somebody. Ed said, yes, said, I've got your man, said Guy Lookabaugh. He said, he coached the University of Kansas 3 years, been down at Ardmore, made a wonderful record down there this year. Said, if you can get him, why, he's your man. Well, we had gone out to the mountains and had told my wife's mother, who lived in Frederick, Oklahoma, told her where we were going, and as far as I know, nobody else in the state of Oklahoma knew where we were. But Ed, when they asked him about it, he said, well, I'll try and locate Guy. So he knew that I had married a girl where I coached down there that year at Frederick. So he got on the phone and had some good central operators there who knew everybody in town, and they got her on the telephone, and she gave him our address. Imagine my amazement when the man out there who owned the cottage came out Wednesday evening to bring some supplies and brought me a telegram. That was Northeastern, and they wanted me to come for an interview, and I did come, and I took the job, and I stayed there 7 years.
Of the people you have coached in any sport, you've coached a number of different sports, which of these people, thinking of those who have made a name in sports history in one area or another, either as a player or later as a coach, could you discuss some of these people you had a part in training?
Well, I think one of the most interesting fellows that I had while I was at Northeastern was a 175-pound wrestler by the name of Bill Bynum. Bill was also a football player, and he made All-State in Oklahoma 1 year as a football player. And in wrestling, I say without hesitation that he is the best defensive wrestler that I ever coached. Bill could do just about anything on the mat with an opponent that I could, and that was plenty. Bill, in one wrestling season, wrestled a boy from Oklahoma University, wrestled to a draw, and this boy won the National Collegiate Championship. He wrestled a boy from Southwestern State Teachers who that same year won the National AAU in that class. So he was as good as either or both of them, and I say defensive because his mental attitude seemed to be, you can't beat me. And I tried to sell Bill on the idea, I'm going to beat you. He was a wonderful athlete, and coached a number of high schools. Well, he's coaching right now in a high school in Oklahoma. He's coached in Oklahoma and in Colorado and various and sundry places.
This thing of holds and defending against them and breaking them is really fascinating. There just are many, many more holes than we realize.
Yes, there are. As a matter of fact, I came to this conclusion and worked on this. There's no position in which you find yourself that you can't, but what you can work aggressively. And of course, the best defense is a good offense. And somebody was talking about condition a little while ago. One of the things that I did in my competition, I did always make the other fellow work harder than I was. If it wasn't anything but more something as simple as saying boo reaching for a leg or something like that. And I got where I thought I was getting pretty clever when I began watching their breathing. And when they'd go to take a breath, and the man wrestling, he takes pretty deep breaths. And you can't get along very long without one. And I'd catch him just as he started to take a breath, and I'd make some maneuver that'd make him catch himself and hold his breath. And I found out by the time I'd done that a few times, why, lots of times they'd begin to get a little bit tired. So in that way, one of the very simple things. Another thing was resist and assist. I had an awful lot of fun with a hold that demonstrated resist and assist. Had an awful lot of fun with that down through the years.
Let them think they've got you and be resisting them.
Yeah, then just help them, flip them clear over.
Does this come instinctively, or you learn?
No, I made this statement. You've got to think about it. You've got to think about it. And I got a laugh out of some of my buddies when we were talking about wrestling, and I said, I have learned more wrestling in bed at night thinking than you ever learned on the mat. Well, learning to wrestle in bed, you know, they thought that was funny. Well, what I was meaning, I'd lay there and I'd find myself going through holes. You've got to think about it.
You read Psycho-Cybernetics, you know, the same thought of shooting the basketball. I suppose maybe there's a little of that to it.
A while ago, you mentioned Bill Bryan as one of the outstanding people you'd coached, but I heard you...
Bynum.
I mean, Bynum. Didn't you coach, while you were at Ardmore, you had a terrifically good basketball team?
Yeah.
And wasn't this boy Carnes on it? Wasn't Massett on there too?
Yeah, Massett.
General Massett?
He was, yeah.
Tell all about him.
Well, he was a good boy. I had, let's see, Prather Brown. Prather Brown is now superintendent of schools at Frederick, Oklahoma, where I did my first coaching job. And I had some communication with him not too long ago. Prather's been a good educator in the state of Oklahoma. And I had Massett. He was a good halfback. He was a good man. And I had a boy by the name of Brady who played center for me on the basketball team. They'd graduated all their basketball team. They didn't expect to have anything, but they wanted me to see what I could do anyway. Well, I'd kind of been in a basketball Hall of Fame up there at University of Kansas because Paul Gallen was recognized as one of the top coaches in the United States. And not only that, Dr. Naismith, who was the inventor of the game of the basketball, he was on our staff there. I worked with him there for 4 years.
Was that the athletic staff or the physical education?
Physical education staff. And I wanted to put a boy on the Olympic team. I didn't quite make it. I turned out some real good wrestlers, and I turned out some of them who came as close as you can come without making it.
Well, now back to this Ardmore team. Didn't you wind up in the state tournament against Hank Iba's classmates?
That's right. Wound up in the state tournament against Hank Iba's. They didn't have anything, and they didn't expect anything. And I had my own ideas about basketball, And I got the boys out there and started working on them as a different system, and they weren't too happy with it. And finally, some of them went to the principal, and they were kind of complaining about it. Their coach wasn't any good, and they didn't like what he was doing. And I think the principal was a little bit sympathetic with them. But when they came back to me, I told them, I said, boys, you know, I'm the one who's getting this drugstore clerk's salary for coaching you. And if you turn out bad, I'm the one that gets all the blame. If you have a fairly successful season, I'm going to get the credit for it. And if I'm going to have to take all the blame and get a chance at a little bit of credit, we're going to play basketball the way I think is best for the boys that we have here on this team. Now, if any of you don't like it, now is a good time to quit, because we're going to go on into this. You're just well started in it now, and we're going right on into it. It's simple. Well, I didn't lose any of them. I had a boy by the name of Brady who was, I used him some at center because I didn't have anybody else. He was a lanky, spindling sort of kid with butterfingers. He dropped an awful lot of balls, but he was the best prospect that I had. Even the postmaster had his ideas about how the basketball team should be run, because they'd had a pretty good team the year before, and maybe he had a boy on it. They didn't want Brady to play center. They wanted me to make some changes around and use Brown as center and leave Brady off. But I didn't, and that's, I told him that right then he looked like the best center we had, and I was going to use him. Well, at the end of the season, they elected him most valuable player and captain for the next year, and he developed into a right good basketball player. And we won our district championship, our regional championship, both cases beating teams that had beaten us early in the season. Defeated them quite decisively, came up to Oklahoma City to the state tournament, and played against Hank Ibis' team in a game in which he beat us 4 points that he scored right in the middle of the dead-gum game, and we never were able to overcome it. And at that time, they were having national championships, and he went on to Chicago with his team and won the national championship up there by 4 points. So we had, any way you take it, we had a pretty good basketball team. And the boys liked it, and they liked all of the boys. And I think they were even got to where they could kind of tolerate the coach a little bit.
Sounds like a real good story.
Excellent story. Do you think of any other players, or do you think of any other thing that that we haven't asked that we ought to put on tape? It could be an experience outside of sports that you might feel has some historical interest or human interest. Can you think of anything that?
Well, of course, I've been connected with sports in one way or another quite a lot. Just in way of passing, something else that I've done that hasn't been mentioned. I refereed the National Collegiate Wrestling Tournament a couple of times, one time in Wisconsin, the other time in Pennsylvania, at Penn State. An interesting thing at that Penn State meet, when they got down to two men each in that is up to the finals, in the wrestling, there were 16 boys, and over half of those boys had been coached by Art Griffith, Central High School in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Some of them went up to Michigan State. One or two of them went to Michigan. Cliff Keene went up there, and he drew some boys after him.
When did Paul Keene come on the scene?
I don't remember just who Paul did succeed at Oklahoma University, but he was a good coach, and he had good teams. He began to bring them up.
He was one of Gallagher's students, too.
Paul never wrestled much. Cliff Keene, there's Cliff and Paul. Now, Cliff was a 158-pounder, and the year that I was out fighting a depression and one thing and another, he was on the team. He was on the 1923 team and won all of his matches, and was in school, and I worked out with him a couple of times after I went back up to Stillwater to get in shape, try to make the Olympic team. Paul came, I talked with him, met him on the campus, and he came over and worked out with me a time or two.
One question I intended to ask you, and we got away from, whatever happened between you and cigarettes? I mean, when you went back into, out of basketball and into wrestling?
Well, I was in and out of athletics. And when I was in athletics, I usually discarded the cigarettes. When I got out, well, I don't know why, but I usually picked them up again. Then I started smoking a pipe. And I stayed with my pipe regularly until 5 years ago, when I was 70 years old. I quit without thinking anything about it. I just quit. I left my pipe and tobacco on my desk or on my chest in the morning when I dressed. And after I'd had my breakfast, well, I started to feel for my pipe, and I didn't have it. And I said, well, I'll get it after a while. I went on another half hour or such a matter and started feeling for it again. And, well, I'll get it after a while. Well, the first thing I know, I'd postponed it for a day. And I said, well, I'll see about that in the morning. And the next morning, I did the same thing. I found that it didn't take very long until those periods of gnawing agony for a cigarette, became farther and farther between, and they became less and less powerful. So I didn't say that I was going to quit. I didn't promise myself or anybody else. As a matter of fact, I hadn't thought about it until it just happened that way. But when I got it started, I thought, well, that's a good thing, and I'll just keep it going.
You're 75 now.
Yeah.
Right. I bet there's not many people today could take him on a wrestling match looking at his physique and everything today.
I want to ask him this. He said his father's name was Frank, and you grew up around Blaine County somewhere. Near Watonga, was it?
Yes. Yes, all the Lookabaughs came down from southern Kansas and settled there in Blaine County near Watonga. Mrs. Calvert's mother was a Richmond and a Lookabaugh, and they settled with all of my grandfather's quite an old chap. He had three families. The first one was Mrs. Calvert's mother, one child. Mother died, and he went to war and fought on the northern side. When it was over, he came back and went out. He was a Pennsylvanian. Went out to Illinois and got married, reared another family, and finally moved down to Kansas and still had his family. They lived there for a while, and his second wife died, and he married her sister. And They lived there in southern Kansas until the Oklahoma Territory was opened up, and they moved down there in 1893, a year after the big run, and they went down there and bought some homesteaders' rights. He'd lived there a year and made certain improvements, and they went down and bought it. They lived there in the community, and all the Lookabaughs lived there, except they're pretty well scattered out now. You ask about Frank. He lives on out west here in Oklahoma City.
Well, now, Frank was your father, the one I was referring to.
Frank was my father.
And who was Jim's father? Did you know?
Well, he was Ed, and my father was Frank. Jim's father was Ed, and then there was another brother who was Ira, and another one who was Clive, who was the big short-horned man, who was the big rancher out here, and he was my guardian administrator from a brother and myself, and we lived there on that short-horn ranch for years and years.
This has been an interview with Guy Lookabaugh, who now lives in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. The date is August the 6th, 1971. We're making the interview is being made by Penn Woods and Charles Sausberry, and it's being made in the home of Mrs. George Calvert in Oklahoma City.
Wonderful. That's great.
I found